Why don't we get started? People are going to trickle in while we're having this conversation. So welcome to the New York Information Security Meetup / the Cyber Guild. It's July 23rd, just a few minutes past 4 o'clock. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Sid Trivedi, right? Is that how do you pronounce your last name?
Trivedi.
Trivedi. Okay, I gave it my best shot. Thank you for.
You did a pretty good job.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So Sid, maybe we can get started. And I always ask this question. What's your favorite superhero and why, if you have one?
It's a great one. Oh man,
it's an icebreaker.
Who would be my favorite superhero? I guess, could we say broadly fictional character?
Yeah, of course.
Because in science, I'm more of a science fiction geek. But I'd say if we were talking about science fiction, it would probably be Captain Picard in Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yeah,
if it was superhero, probably Batman.
Yeah,
as a kid, I would have said that.
That's a good one. So you are part of a foundation capital. You basically invest in companies, right? So maybe kind of walk us through the history of how you started, how you were in high school, like what was your favorite things to do, type of thing, and then kind of walk us through like your career path and maybe some of the
sure.
Defining moments of where you like took a right turn or a left turn and it got you to where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a couple of things. I lived in a bunch of different countries as a kid. I lived in Indonesia, I lived in Singapore, I lived in India. I spent broadly a ton of time in Asia. And even within places like India, I lived in multiple different cities. So I think I lived in total in the first 7 or 8 years of my life. I think we moved around 6 or 7 times. So it was a completely different city every year. And most of my middle and high school years were spent in Singapore. And I was incredibly lucky in that my father was relatively early at Nokia, the mobile phone company, as it was making this decision to create the mobile phone. So Nokia is a company that's been around for well over 100 years, has had, in itself has almost been an entrepreneurial firm. But, in the 90s, Nokia made a big decision to move into the mobile phone market. And, my dad joined the firm right around when that decision was made.
Wow, good
so
timing.
He was relatively early, and it was good timing. But as a kid, I got to see this transformation that all of us saw, from desktop to mobile that was happening. We went from a personal computer, which was starting to become pretty synonymous, to a mobile phone, which significantly increased the number of people who had access to technology. So it was a lot of fun as a kid to go and see every single iteration of the mobile phone, by Nokia at least, and see the creation of the early smartphone revolution, which Nokia helped to go and create. That really for me it gave this inkling that technology would be an exciting career in the longer term. And as it so happened, my mom was an investment banker. So it was really funny. Like, she was in finance, my dad was in tech. And as a kid, I got to see both of these avenues. And I was like, wow, these are both really, really interesting fields. Like, she was working on deals that were talked about, in the public world. She was working with people who are incredibly important. And so it was very exciting to kind of see both of their roles and see the impact that both of their careers had on the world overall. So I felt like, hey, when I grow up, I want to go and do something in tech or in finance. And so I was lucky. I moved to the US to go to Cornell University in upstate New York. And I chose to do, as my field, my specializations in economics and biology. And part of that was I really liked both of those subjects. And the second part was I always thought, maybe I'll do something in biotech. And, it's funny, I never used the biology degree, never used any of the healthcare background. But, while I was at Cornell, I got to learn a little bit about technology. I helped to go and create this now a very large venture capital club at Cornell, which works with VC firms. And I got to meet through it a bunch of pretty important general partners at other firms, including actually at Foundation, a former general partner at Foundation. And that gave me a good indication of what this career would be like. And I said, wow, this is a great career that'll, mingle both the technology and the finance backgrounds. And, I made the decision after college to go into banking. And I joined Barclays, which was basically at the time going through this transition from Lehman Brothers to Barclays. This was after the '08 crisis, that we were seeing a lot of changes happening. And I made that decision because I looked at what is a successful venture capitalist? And I could figure out that there were three paths or three successful types of venture capitalists. One, and I'll explain what I think is a similarity between all these three at the end, but there's one group of people who are who've been in the finance or consulting fields. There's a second group of people who have been entrepreneurs and usually have created very successful companies, either taken a company public or sold a company for over $1 billion. And then there's this third bucket, which is basically very, very senior executives, CEOs, COOs, principally at Fortune 2000 companies. And those people usually end up going into venture. If you look at the vast majority of partners at my firm or at any of the other big firms, you will find that there's a similarity that they all fit into one of these three buckets, or most of them do. And I think the similarity between all the three buckets is it's what that experience gives you is an understanding of what scale looks like. So, it really helps you. If you take one of those three career parts, it helps you to realize this is what a successful company looks like. In the first bucket, you get to go and work with a lot of them as an advisor. In the second bucket, you obviously get to go and create, hopefully, one of them. And the third bucket, you're a senior executive at the company. But you get to see scale in action. And that is very, very critical to know at the early stage when you're investing in venture. You need to know what good looks like before you get into the business of trying to pick what is good. So,
yeah, and
sorry, go ahead, David.
No, it's fascinating. So it looks like you've you spent some time in investment banking, also private equity groups.
Yep.
And then you became a venture capitalist. So what's made you? So first of all, it's awesome that you're both your parents came from different sides, and then actually in your role right now, you basically combine the two roles, right? You're in tech and also in capital, basically. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. So, what do you say, in terms of different various roles that you filled in the past, several years? What do you say that it's like the one that prepared you the most, to be a great, venture capitalist?
I don't think there's a good answer to that. I wish there was one thing or one role that was incredibly helpful. I think it's been multiple roles. And I'll mention kind of that career in banking. In banking, I got to see a lot of companies scale. And I was very lucky. I joined Barclays in the New York office, the building that's synonymous with the '08 crisis, which was the Lehman Brothers global headquarters, at a time when the firm was thinking about technology, and I joined the technology investment banking group. And the way that the group was structured was everything that was done around consumer internet was worked on out of our Menlo Park office, and everything in enterprise software was worked on out of our New York office. And as it so happened, I joined around a time when there were a couple of, at the time, small companies, Palo Alto Networks, FireEye, SourceFire, a very, very small company called Rapid7. And the first three were starting to gear up to become real big companies. And I joined, and as it so happened, we started to cover cybersecurity as an angle. And I said, you know what, this seems like an interesting category. I was kind of given it, and I started to look into it. And I got to learn a ton about this market. And at the same time, I got to see a bunch of these companies go public while I was still at the firm. And then post that, I went into private equity. And I decided to move into private equity instead of going directly into venture capital, because I felt like, now I understand how these big companies look like and what were the things that they did right, what were the things that they did wrong. But I still don't feel like I have the operational experience. And the thing with private equity, where it's different to venture capital, is most private equity firms own their companies. So they are the majority shareholder. They usually own 80, 90% of the company. So if the company succeeds or fails, they are very much connected to that success or failure. So they are very, very focused on hiring executives, on coming up with revenue strategy, on coming up with product strategy. And if you're at a private equity firm that is very operationally focused, which is where the firm I was at, Symphony Technology Group, was, I got to learn a lot through that experience. And on top of that, in my last two jobs before Foundation, I had this unique opportunity that I worked with two very, very successful founders. The founder of Symphony Technology Group was a gentleman named Ramesh Wadhwani, who's the richest Indian American. He's worth a little bit over $3 billion. He's on the Forbes 400 list. And he's also one of the most successful enterprise software founders. He'd founded 3 companies, the last of which ended up selling for just under $10 billion. So, and that was a small team. It was a 12-person investing team. So I got to spend a decent amount of time listening to Ramesh and hearing what his perspectives was. And then post that, I ended up working for another billionaire, Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay and the largest shareholder in both eBay and PayPal, who had a different experience. He came from more of the consumer and fintech angle. And I was still investing in enterprise software, but I got to see some of his thoughts on, what could we do differently in our market. So it was a lot of experience across these multiple roles that helped me to hopefully become a better investor today.
That sounds like an absolutely incredible experience, right? You were basically being, had the ability to kind of shadow these incredible people. So coming back to your experience, fast forward to today, what would you say are the top, 3 categories that you look from a cybersecurity perspective that you potentially will invest today? I'm assuming you have, kind of a preference, knowing kind of the market where it's going.
Yeah, I think that there's lots of different categories that are interesting. And obviously, our current pandemic has changed strategy for everybody in terms of how they think about things. But I'll broadly break out the cybersecurity landscape into 3 big buckets. There is a software-based attack vector, there's a human attack vector, and there's a hardware attack vector. And today there are 26 public cybersecurity companies. And 24 of them are focused on the software-based attack vector. 2 of them are focused on the human attack vector, and 0 today are focused on the hardware attack vector. You could argue maybe half of one of the software companies is in hardware, but that's about it. So, sorry, you're going to ask something.
No, I was about to say, why is that? It seems like it's totally skewed. But you're probably about to answer that anyway.
And I was about to answer. It's a fantastic question. I think it's skewed because in the past, we have always assumed that the way that you breach a company, a corporate environment, is through the software-based attack vector. And that obviously, and the reason we believe that is because we assume that technology is beaten by technology. And we forget the vulnerabilities that we face from employees. And the most recent Twitter attack is a great example of that situation. And then I think the second bucket is the vulnerabilities that we face for the number of devices that are sitting inside physical environments. And obviously today, that third bucket has become even more complex because the office is not a physical place. It is multiple different locations. We are all in our homes. We're accessing, our work materials through a public Wi-Fi that we are paying for. Sometimes we're using a corporate laptop. Sometimes we're using our own device. We're using a ton of these webcams. We're obviously using microphones. We might be using our own printers to print, confidential documents. But there's a lot of complexity that has been created because of the advantages of technology. And that usually creates opportunity. And clearly in cybersecurity, it is creating opportunity. So I believe on the human side and the hardware side, we will see a number of companies be created. And we will also see a number of large attacks happen. And the Twitter attack, the most recent one, is a fantastic example of the human side vulnerability. On the software side, I think the biggest change we are seeing right now is for the last half decade, we've been talking about the shift to the cloud, from on-prem to hybrid cloud. And that's been happening, and it's been happening, to be honest, David, in a very slow pace. If you looked at it pre-pandemic, we were about, of the Fortune 2000, about 20 to 25% of total infrastructure was in the cloud. The vast majority was still on-prem. And most of that 20 to 25% was in private cloud. And what the pandemic has created for everybody is it's shown the flexibility of the cloud. And that flexibility is that when you have lots of demand, you don't have to deal with getting more data centers. And when you have no demand, you don't have to pay for all that excess data center footprint that you have. And the second bucket is when you want to go and create or build more technology. With the cloud, you're able to integrate new software much more faster than you can with a data center. With a data center, you usually have to go and put in a physical box. And it's very hard to access the data centers right now, given the pandemic. So I do believe, in the next 2 years, we will see a much faster adoption than we have in the last 5 years to this move to the hybrid cloud, and particularly to a move to the public cloud. And the cybersecurity vendors that are focused on that transition and enabling that transition will end up capitalizing significantly.
Well, they say, tide floats all boats, right? So,
that's right.
This is the opportunity. So, from your perspective, and tell me about a bit about what stage do you typically prefer to invest? Is it Series A, B, C? What's your preference on there? And then maybe talk about the selection process a little bit.
It's a fantastic question. So our firm, Foundation Capital, we do specifically early stage venture investing. And we define early stage as being a time when we are the first or the second institutional investor in the company. And the reason we say institutional versus just general investors, sometimes there are rounds that are done by friends and family and angel investors. We're usually the first formal investor that comes in and helps to come up with a path to scale a business. And for us, from a stage perspective, that means seed, Series A, and Series B. And when we invest at those rounds, we typically lead the round. So we typically take between 20 to 30% ownership. We typically take a board seat, and we're very active investors in helping our companies scale. So that's where I spend most of my time. And from an employee or number of people on the team perspective, when we get involved, there are as few as 1 or 2 people. And my most recent investment was 2 founders who had come up with an idea, and we're working on that idea. Didn't have product, didn't have any other people, and I made that investment. And usually where we cap out is when there are about 30 or 35 people on the team. After that, we're not the initial investor. And once we invest, we are there for the long run. So our average hold period in our investments across all of our investments over the last 25 years is about 10 years. So we've been in investments where we've been there for much longer. In Netflix, one of our investments, we invested in 1997. And my partner, Mike Shu, is now retired, stepped off the board of Netflix in 2012. So it was a long, long game.
It's absolutely fascinating. So, what's interesting is that just from my, kind of my knowledge is there's not that many companies, investor capital that like to invest in such an early stage. They perceive it as risky, right? They like to maybe potentially do a Series B where there's already revenue, it's already established, and there's already quite a few customers. But it sounds from what you're expressing is that you basically had two guys and an idea on a napkin, right? And you said, okay, let's make the investment. Why have you decided that, or the firm decided that you want to take that risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think there's this aspect that when you come in early, the likelihood of you generating outsized outcomes increases dramatically. When you come into a company at a time when things are already going right, it's very, very hard to create astronomical outcomes. You end up in a situation where you'll have a good outcome, but you won't have a phenomenal outcome. I think the second bucket is when you look at me or my partners, our experience is such that we're used to going early. We understand how scale looks like, and we've we want to bring that capability, those learnings to the early stage. We feel that if you can help companies at the early stage to think about some of the mistakes that they could make, and hopefully they will make fewer of them and they will get to that later stage much more faster. I think the third bucket is, to be honest, me and my partners, we all enjoy being at that early stage much more than we do, going at the later stage. There's a reason why, I did the public company advisory work. I did the large private company investor work, and those are fun experiences. But I get most excited by helping 2 or 3 or 10 or 15 people scale their companies to be 200, 300, 400, 500, and hopefully in the future 1,000 or more employees. That brings me a lot of joy.
And it sounds like you only need one Netflix to really to have that home run and pay for it all. And also and you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but you have the ability to influence, right, and shape the company much more so than coming into an established business, right? So you have like the ability to really make an impact. So at this early stage, it's even more critical to have a sound selection process where you investigate, not just the technology and the market, but also, the founders themselves. Can you walk us through the process of selection and what kind of is deal breaker for you, and what that you see basically says, okay, this is what I want. This is the investment I'm going to make.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the biggest issue with the early stage, there's something I wish I could fix, and there's no solution, would be I wish I could come up with a grid and say, this is how you can score a good company versus a bad company. But when you're looking at the 2 founders with the idea on a napkin, it's very, very hard to create a grid and create a score. There's no real metric that you can use that can be unbiased. But I will broadly bucket out how we think about strategy in a couple of different buckets. One, we look very closely at team, understanding who are the people who are starting the company, what makes them so unique, why are they so special, and why would they potentially work together? 2, we look at market. What is the market size of the opportunity at hand? If it's a small market, why is it going to grow into a much bigger market? What are the tangential markets that one needs to think about? 3, if there's any level of product that's been built out or a roadmap, what makes this product different from other players in the market? And this is where we spend a lot of time trying to understand competition. And this is where having that specialized experience, for example, in my case, I spent the last 8 years in the IT and security market. Having that specialized experience over the last 8 years is incredibly helpful. 4, obviously metrics ends up being important if there are any. And usually when it's 2 guys in a napkin or 2 girls in a napkin, that's not the case. But if you have 10 or 15 or 20 people, usually you have some level of early metrics. It might be a couple of early customers. If it's a consumer company, you might have some app-related data in terms of usage patterns. And we use that to the extent that we can. And we look at prior companies that have been successful, whether they're in our portfolio or not, and what they saw in those early days. And then the 5th bucket, which is still important, I'd like to remind founders of it, is valuation, which is, is this an opportunity where we feel like, A, we can put in sufficient capital, but B, more importantly, get enough ownership for us to feel that it is a meaningful amount of our time that we're going to give away. So those are the 5 big areas that we spend time on.
So tell me about so I interviewed a VC capitalist who mentioned specifically that sometimes he looks at the kind of the soft, measures, like in a sense that, he wants to see how these folks behave over lunch, outside of the pitch. And I'm assuming you've seen a lot of these, pitches
Yep.
on a regular basis. And then kind of fast forward to where the environment today, the struggle is that, it's very limited in terms of how you can do that today, right? Because it's like, the flights are not there, and it's hard to just go out and, across the country and have, grab lunch or dinner. How do you overcome that? And is it something that you also consider as paramount when making a decision?
Yeah, and it is very paramount. I think it is very, very important to be able to have those soft skills to be able to assess a founder on those skills. And then secondly, I think it is also important for us to think about the opportunities, that of what has made the founder get to that journey. What are the experiences they've had? The same way that you asked me about my background. How did they get to where they are? So, I think those two things are important. How do we kind of fix for that in the current pandemic? I think there have been two things that we've done. And it's coincidental, but the company I mentioned where it was two founders and an idea, both of those founders are on the East Coast. So I didn't get the opportunity to go and meet them in person. There was no way to take a socially distant walk or do all the other things, which I wish you could have done. But the way I solved for that there was I just had multiple meetings. There was a span of time of 3 weeks, where in those 3 weeks, I was on Zoom with the founders every single day, including the weekends. And I got a very good sense for what these people are like. And I felt like I had predicted some things. I felt like, now we're, a month and a half into the investment, or 5 or 6 weeks into the investment. As I look back, I think I was right in a bunch of things. And to be honest, I thought things were difficult in one area and I was completely wrong. They were actually a much better, and I wasn't able to assess that clearly. But it ended up being a positive point. So I think to answer your question, David, it is very tough to do. I think the way that we fix it is by having more touch points. And I mentioned kind of the two founder situation. I've also did diligence in a company where there were 25 people in April, which was still during lockdown. And there, the way I solved it was I decided to meet every single executive on Zoom multiple times at that company to try to get a sense for the culture and the people who are around. So that was helpful. And I think you just end up having to do more touch points than you normally do before making a decision on an investment.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you brought this up. So you basically compensate, kind of the lack of being physically there by doing additional kind of remote meetings. Do you find that the window of opportunities that you talked about, how COVID accelerated kind of the remote work and move to the cloud, do you find the window of opportunities to create a new product and go to market are shrinking? If you look back at the history of, like, let's say firewalls, right? The firewalls were, was dominant, for many, many years. And then we moved to, the advanced persistent threat, the endpoint security, the antivirus, which is still around. And then it sounds like almost like, kind of the cycles of technology buying is diminishing, right? Or, like, I guess the window now is maybe 12 to 18 months before you can kind of launch a product, capture the market, and then maybe potentially get acquired by one of the larger public vendors out there.
I think it's a fantastic question. It's interesting. I don't think the window of opportunity has gotten significantly shorter. I think when you're going after creating big companies, and this is where I think your last point is important in highlighting. If you're going after creating a company that ends up being a feature in a broader platform, that's a different opportunity set than if you're looking to go and create a company that ends up hopefully being public on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ. And I think in that second bucket, it takes time to go and create enduring companies. And you will end up building multiple different features to create a broader platform that will end up hopefully standing the test of time. I think if your company is very razor focused on solving one pain point, is it true that the number of months that you have available have gone down? Yeah, probably. And the reason is because as the cloud has enabled us to, effectively reduce the cost of computing, people across the world have had access like never before. And it hasn't just been the cloud. laptops have gotten cheaper, webcams have gotten cheaper. We've been able to go and communicate in a much better format than we could 10, 15 years ago. So absolutely, for the feature-related companies, the window of opportunity is much shorter because there's more innovation going on globally. Yeah, the average person globally has the opportunity to become an entrepreneur. But I think ultimately, if you want to build an enduring company, you will end up having to create multiple different features in a broader platform. And that opportunity is still multiple years. It still requires 6 or 7 years to create a platform.
Yeah, and it takes a while. It takes a while to launch. To design a product, launch it, and then move it to production and get the adoption, and then get the the initial customers. So I have a couple questions here from the participants. Would you say like companies like Intel, which works on hardware chip, is an example of hardware cyber company? And then the same question applied to Apple. How do you classify that in terms of hardware cyber problems that they potentially fix?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't consider them as security companies. Firstly, Intel and Apple do a lot of other things. So that's why I don't classify it as a hardware security company. Now, do they care about security vulnerabilities? Both of those companies do. But just because we are since we're highlighting Intel, there's been a lot of talk from Spectre and Meltdown in terms of the impact on the Intel vulnerabilities that have been created as a result of that, the Intel chipset vulnerabilities. So I think, and Intel has had lots of complexity in terms of ensuring that they don't face the same level of vulnerabilities going forward as they build out the next generation of chips. So are these companies thinking about security more so than they were before? Absolutely. But does that mean that they will end up supporting security, particularly in the hardware front, in multiple different use cases? I don't actually think that's going to be the case. I think there's a whole span of other companies that will be created that won't end up kind of being part of Intel or Apple.
Yeah, it's interesting. The other question here that somebody posted here is assessing investment opportunities in the context of the thousands of vendors out there, in terms of the landscape. And I don't know if you probably went to RSA this past year, and it's truly remarkable the number of companies, that number of vendors out there. So how do you assess companies that come to you and that there's already a couple companies that do the same?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So I think there's a couple of ways that you do this. One, I have over the last 6 or 7 years gone and built out a pretty significant customer network in IT and security. And part of this was 6 years ago, I started to feel like, for every FireEye, there would be another 20, 30, 40 detection response companies. And I was wrong by a couple of orders of magnitude. There were 3, 4, 500 companies, not 20, 30, 40. So, but my assumption was there would be a lot more competitors in this space. And it was starting to get confusing what differentiated one player from another. So I started to build out a customer network. And today that customer network is a little bit over 150 executives, which are CTOs, CIOs, CISOs, at principally Fortune 2000 companies. And those people help me to assess what is important on a macro level, where they're spending their broader budget. But then more on a micro level, if they're looking at a category like deception, what are the key companies that they're looking at? And why are those key companies interesting to them? And the last thing they do is, for the areas that they're not spending time in, they're able to help me to assess whether a new idea, the two entrepreneurs coming up with the idea on a napkin, is that an idea that's interesting enough that it merits creating a company around? So for me, that has ended up becoming a secret sauce. And it's taken multiple years. I made a hunch that there would be a lot more competitors, and that has proved out to be correct. And I decided that the customers would help me to assess that in a different way than in any other category in technology broadly. I think the second part has also been around understanding the competition. I spend a lot of time fragmenting the market in different ways. and and creating my own landscape on every single sub-market to be able to say, okay, here are the players, and making sure that when I hear a pitch from an entrepreneur, I get to, in my head, bucket them into some category. And if I can't bucket them into a category, then I think about, well, is there a new category that I haven't thought about? And should I be creating a new category, in my own landscape? But it's really a combination of getting the customer mindset. And the second part is actually, going and creating some level of fragmentation in that very broad landscape of thousands of security vendors.
In that network that you've built of CISOs and executives, does it ever come back to, okay, there's a demand from their side, they come back to you and say, hey, Sid, I have a gap currently that I'm looking to fulfill, and go out there and see if there's somebody who's addressing this? And so would you ever go out to potentially people that and say, if you build this, I will invest?
So it's a great, it's actually the what you just highlighted is exactly what I do in the cases of the couple of entrepreneurs who are thinking about a new idea. So when you build these relationships over multiple years, particularly with repeat founders who have been successful before, have ended up selling a company, and have always dreamed of doing more. They've always said, I sold this company for 50 million, 100 million, 300 million, 400 or 500 million, but I want to go and build the next CrowdStrike or the next Palo Alto Networks. Those founders end up coming back. And when they come back and I get to talk to them in advance of kind of their decision to move back into the entrepreneurial world, and I end up brainstorming with them, I usually bring customers into those brainstorming sessions. And these brainstorming sessions, for context, just this week, there are two of them that have been going on for me. There are two different founding teams that are working on ideas. But I try to go and get customers involved early because they get to go and hear some of the ideas that these entrepreneurs have and say, that's a silly idea. Actually, this is something that's more interesting. Or, oh my goodness, I never thought about that. That could be a solution to A or B category that we're facing. And part of that is making sure that you get customers involved early on in the journey.
Have you ever come across an idea or a company that was, potentially an investment opportunity, turned them down because you thought it was a ridiculous idea that's never going to make it, and then they turn around and the market was just booming, that you just made the wrong decision?
Yeah, it's happened. It's happened multiple times. There's so many that I have in my head that would be relevant. I think most of the time, the biggest issue that I have had is I have not been able to give up on valuation, to be honest. It's funny when we think about things and we're trying to argue between, coming into a company at a 30 million valuation versus a 50 million valuation. And we're doing that because we're trying to figure out how do we get our 20 to 30% ownership while not giving up too much capital, because we want to reserve additional capital for later rounds. But the issue with that is if a company ends up being incredibly successful, it will end up being a multiple billion-dollar situation. And there, it's very unfortunate when you realize, I made the decision not to invest because I couldn't go from 30 to 50. And this company is now worth $3 billion. And sometimes it's my fault. I couldn't get comfortable on valuation and I was wrong. And sometimes it's broadly as a partnership, we make the decision to not take so much risk because we say, well, here are all the ways things could go wrong. Here are the 50 different situations we've seen when things went wrong. And we forget to think about when things go right. Here's the great opportunity that we could see ahead of us. As unfortunately, and I'll give two examples of this. One, which is exactly this problem of valuation. I looked at Auth0, which recently closed at almost a $3 billion valuation at a very early stage, the Series B and the Series C. I looked at it, and the Series A was done by the seed investor, so there was no opportunity to do the Series A. But the B and C, I had the opportunity to do that investment, and I made a decision on both cases to not invest because of valuation. And to this day, it is one of the biggest misses I think I will have made in my career. in venture. And I felt, if we looked at my memo for the Series B, it said in there, I believe this will be a multi-billion-dollar company. And that part was correct. It was just unfortunate that I couldn't get my partners to accept the higher valuation and get comfortable myself to be able to go and say, hey, I'm going to put my career on the line for this. The second one is a company called Big ID, which is still TBD whether it ends up being a big company. But I met Dimitri and Nimrod, the founders, very, very early at the seed stage. And it's funny, if you go and talk to them, and I meet Dimitri multiple times. I saw him a couple of months ago at RSA, and he said this to me again. But they laugh and they say, you could have done this deal well before everyone else. And for me, I just couldn't get comfortable with how much of services there was in that solution. And I felt that there was going to be some failure there. But what I forgot and what I didn't keep into account was Dimitri and Nimrod were successful founders, and they recognized the problem I was facing. And they felt that they could solve for that problem in the long term. So I think it's learnings. And for me, it's making sure that every time you make a mistake, you think about, what can you learn from that mistake, and what do you do for the future to correct that.
Thank you very much for revealing that. It's I think it's very astute of you, and revealing to to show that you make mistakes like everyone else, and hindsight is 2020. And I know Dimitri really well. He actually presented in my group a few years back,
awesome.
and we did a couple of joint events with Big Idea, and yet it's TBD whether they're going to make it. But as you mentioned, at the time they were very very small. So let's wrap up. We're kind of running out of time, but this has been absolutely awesome. To get a glimpse of your job, and what you're doing, and the industry as a whole. Maybe kind of wrap up with some positive notes. I always try to do that when we kind of wrap up. Have you seen any positive development from COVID in terms of either personal, professional things that you've come across?
It's funny. I think the biggest positive from the COVID situation, as a firm, our view has always been that if you're investing, and we invest at the seed A and B stage, but if you're investing at the seed stage, the founders have to be where we are. We have to physically be able to see them relatively quickly. They have to be a drive away, is our view. So if you look at our investments, overall across the portfolio, about 65% of our companies are based here in the Bay Area. And that means that we have investments in other regions. Obviously, the East Coast is an area which we spend a lot of time in. But if you further cut that out, and I'm pretty sure you would see the data, 90% of our seed companies, particularly on the enterprise side, would be based in the Bay Area. Because our view was, you have to be close to the founders. There's a lot of issues that comes into company creation. And it's just helpful to sit down one-on-one or two-on-one with these founders and be able to provide them perspectives and do the whiteboards. And what COVID has shown us is that that's not the case. And I gave the example of my most recent investment, which was a seed stage company where the founders are based on the East Coast. And I think we've become more comfortable investing early in companies that are not in the Bay Area. And what hopefully that will mean for founders who are not in this region is they don't have to physically move here that early. Now, I still believe most of the talent, at least for now, is based out here in the Bay Area. So if you want to go and scale a company, does that mean you'll eventually have to move here? I do believe that's the case. If you want to go and hire a fantastic VP of sales, VP of marketing, VP of growth, there are not a lot of options in most of the other regions. And there are not a lot of available options. The most available options obviously based here. But that ability to invest early in companies that are not here is one huge benefit. I think the second benefit has been, it has helped all of us to realize what's important in life on a personal level, on a professional level as well. Personal level, I think from a family perspective, it's helped a lot of my founders. I'm sure you've seen this, David, in your interviews. It has helped them to go and spend time with their families. They're on the road all the time, particularly in IT and security, the category where you're constantly trying to meet a customer A, customer B, conference A, conference B. It's just nice to be able to sit at home and have dinner with your family at the end of the day, or have breakfast at the beginning of the day with your family. And it's been fantastic to give them that opportunity to spend time at home. And it's also shown them that they don't need to be in every single conference to succeed. I think the second thing is these critical events when they happen, whether it's the '08 financial crisis or obviously the current pandemic, the learning is you get to see who actually delivers for the company, and whether the company, is a startup at the 2 or 5 person level, or a scaled company at the 300-400 person level. You get to see who are the top 10 or 15 people. They really end up shining in those times, because when things are not working, those are the people who jump up and say, you know what, I'm going to stop complaining and figure out a solution. I'm going to think about what can we do to optimize, what can we do to solve this problem. And they usually have a very, very positive view towards things. And you get to see all those people act. And it's been a lot of fun to see those executives really stand out in these companies.
These are wonderful and really enlightening points. Thanks for sharing those. I think everyone can relate. So Sid, where can people find you? And then maybe, because a lot of people are going to try to find you and reach out to you, maybe you can share some best practices in terms of how to reach out to a VC.
Yeah, it's a great, it's a good point. So I think the best, so there are multiple ways to reach me. One, you can go to our website. You can send an email through that. Two, you can send me a LinkedIn message. I respond to almost every LinkedIn message. David can attest to that. I don't have any issues responding. I read every single one of them. If it's not relevant, I'll say, hey, look, this is not my area of expertise. And then the third way is to go through somebody who knows me. That's obviously always helpful. It results usually in a faster response time. But to be honest, right now, my response time, because we're all in lockdown, has been very good across the board in all of these situations. And the main reason is all the travel time has gone away. So I've been able to gain, on an average day, 2 to 3 hours back of time that I would be spending, driving my car to a point A or point B. So, I think all of those three ways is a good way. I think in terms of what you should include, I think just explaining what you're doing, explaining why you should talk to me, why I'm the right person to talk to, and then just explaining what you'd like to talk about. If it's a company that you're thinking of starting a company, I've seen lots of those messages, and I'm happy to brainstorm with you. If you already have a company and you're looking to raise a round, I'm happy to brainstorm with you on that topic, and obviously go through a more formal pitch process. And then if you're just want to learn more about entrepreneurship, I'm happy to also talk to you. There are lots of executives who I talk to who just want to talk about entrepreneurship. They just want to understand, what can they do more in their organization to be more innovative. That's also an area that I'm happy to talk about. But just explaining those three things is important.
Thank you, Sid. Thank you very much for taking part in this event and participating in the group session. It's hopefully we'll get to meet in person. Just going to say, in New York City when things open up, just as an FYI, since you're an investor, in the past 8 years, since 2013, I've been hosting these physical events. And, out of the 85 or 90 companies, there's about 8 of them that got acquired for over $2.5 billion collectively.
Wow.
A company is a very early stage. Now, I don't have any stake in those businesses. Otherwise, I'll probably be sitting somewhere else. But the odds are pretty good. I don't know if the DNA of companies that presented my group is such that it lends itself to be successful. But who knows? So hopefully you'll get to participate. And looking forward to potentially seeing you in the upcoming events.
Likewise, David. So look, I prior to the pandemic, I was in New York City once every 2 months. As I mentioned, I used to live in the city and work in the city, so I very much miss it, and I enjoy going back. And I have a couple of companies based on the East Coast, so there's enough reasons to be in the city. And it's fantastic that you've gone and created a meetup group for the last few years that has gone and gotten to real scale. I was looking last night at the number of members you have, over 5,000. It's just fantastic to see you spending time to create the security culture on the East Coast, because part of this is I think sometimes we forget when we sit in the Bay Area bubble that there are other regions that are important too. So it's fantastic that you're doing that.
Well,
and I'd love to kind of go and spend time in person.
Yeah, I had help from people like yourself and from people through the group. So I appreciate the support. So stay safe, everyone. And thanks again for joining. And Sid, thank you again for taking part. Looking forward to seeing you in person maybe sometime soon.
Thanks so much, David. Bye.
Take care. Take care all.